Well, it may seem odd to some people that we're going to start with a literary work, something you're all probably fairly familiar with, Homer's Iliad. But really, one of the reasons why I'm really glad that Matson and my old professor Phil Rollinson, who chipped in and helped with this book, by the way, one of the reasons I'm glad that they did that is because what they're really trying to show us in giving us this excerpt from Homer's Iliad is several different things. One, even in a pre-literate culture, and by the way, you can argue about when Homer lived and whether there was a Homer. I don't think there is any doubt that there was a Homer. But, in the 600s, 500s, 700s BC, really we're talking about a pre-literate culture. Now, if you want to read the introduction to Bezel's anthology, The Rhetorical Tradition, which is fine, it's not as thorough as Matson's anthology is in some respects. There's some great points there by Eric Havelock that they quote, and Havelock's a great scholar who goes into the importance of the development of an alphabet and all of that kind of thing. That's a really interesting question. If you're linguistically minded, you certainly want to go into that question. But there's no doubt about it that even in a pre-literate culture, the artful use of language was still A, valued, and B, possible. We kind of think that pre-literate people weren't able or capable of the artful use of language, but they are. Now, on the other hand, you can go and study these great divide theorists, Levi Strauss and some of these other guys, especially the Russian dudes who went out into the middle of Mongolia and interviewed pre-literate cultures and said, wow, these guys really do not have much of a capacity for abstract thought. So, there's a wonderful debate that goes on, and that's not what this class is about, but it certainly is an interesting thing to look at. Because when you look at Homer, you are talking really about a pre-literate culture. Now, I know that Homer, and especially his amanuensis, the guy who writes the stuff down, they were literate, obviously. I think they were anyway. But the vast audience was not literate, and yet they valued the artful use of language, and the artful use of language was quite possible. You didn't lose people when you used fancy sentences, okay? The other thing to remember as you read through this, and again, these notes this lecture is sort of a get ready to read it and what to look for when you read it. Okay, we're not going to go through it line by line in this format because we don't have the time. We'll do that in class a little bit more. The speeches of Agamemnon and Achilles really stand in stark contrast to that of Nestor, okay? So Nestor is this great, older, wise person. Agamemnon, if you remember the tale, is this greedy, opportunistic king of Mycena. Achilles, of course, the son of Thetis, the goddess, and Peleus, and Achilles is marked to die even though he's the greatest of all warriors, and they get into this big blood feud, and it has to do with pride and who gets the hot girl, okay? Agamemnon has a hot girl that he captured in battle, but there's a problem, and that is that his hot girl is the daughter of a priest, and this guy is not just a priest, but he's the priest of Apollo, which makes Apollo very, very angry, and Apollo is doing everything he can to make sure that the Achaeans, otherwise known as the Greeks, aren't succeeding against the Trojans, and everybody's like, hey, what's up? Why is Apollo so ticked off at us? Well, the answer is, you are holding the daughter of his priest kidnapped, and the priest is willing to pay ransom and everything, and all of this kind of stuff, but Agamemnon doesn't want to give her up, and instead, when he does have to finally give her up, he wants to go and take away Achilles' hot girl that he captured fair and square, and Achilles doesn't like this and whatnot. So the blood feud is there, and what you see in both of their speeches through this is just this petulant, emotional, relatively ineffective sort of oratory. Now, that's by design, by the way. Homer was not an idiot. He's giving you speeches that aren't that good by orators, characters that aren't that good at speaking. They just rant, they just vent, you see? But then we get Nestor, and Nestor shows how it's supposed to be done, okay? It's reasoned, it's rational, it's well thought out, it's articulate, it's moving, but here's the problem. You and I listen to Nestor's speech, and we say, what a great guy, what a smart dude. He's so persuasive, but guess what? Achilles and Agamemnon are not persuaded by Nestor's speech. Not really, not at all. His immediate audience isn't. Now, there's a sophisticated point being made here about oratory, so let's give Homer a little bit of credit. I'm going to argue that what Homer is doing is not just putting up the speeches, the lousy speeches by Agamemnon and Achilles, the ones that aren't well thought out, aren't rational, aren't well designed, aren't persuasive, versus Nestor's, which is all of those things. but he's also showing us that unlike us, rational, reasonable, good people who hear the words of Nestor and say, he's right. We're looking at two characters, Agamemnon and Achilles, who refuse to be persuaded by Nestor. There's a barrier there. There's a blockage there. Homer seems to be making some point here, I would argue, that it isn't just the power of the rhetorician, but it's also the receptivity of the audience. So anyway, that's just a little aside on my part. I think that's an interesting thing to think about. I don't know how many people have really thought about that, but I certainly have. So we see our picture of Homer at the top. Don't get the wrong Homer, that's the one at the bottom. Fundamentally, there's a high value placed on oration in the poem. Lots of speeches in this thing. And speeches, by the way, are used as literary devices. I misspelled devices. Digressions, flashbacks. The plot is advanced through the speeches. That's pretty sophisticated. It's not just a he said this and she said that and he said this and then he said that. Homer's using speeches as a plot device and a way to keep the narrative moving. It's also a way to flesh out the character and all these other things. It's a very sophisticated thing. And again, this is largely pre-literate culture. And the distinction that's important here, the distinction between poetry and oratory is really blurred. I mean, you and I think of a rhetorician and a poet as being two different animals. These guys back in that age would not have thought so. They would have thought them as largely the same kinds of things. Wordsmiths, word artists, poets, rhetoricians, whatever it's for. It could be for a sermon, it could be a speech, it could be a poem, it could be a play, whatever. He's a word guy. That's the way they would have largely thought of it, because the things were really blurred and overlapped a lot. Well, let's look at the sophistic movement especially here. And as Matson points out, these were really the first itinerant preachers, teachers and poets. We talked about that, who later developed schools. There were essentially two different approaches to teaching that they embraced. And we're going to see this in this week's lecture material. Here are the readings. Mastering theoretical concepts, or techne. There are those who said, well, the main business of learning how to be a good speaker or write a great speech is that you've got to really memorize lots of theoretical things, concepts, the technical stuff, right? You need to know how to use a this and how many types of that there are. And this school within the sophistic movement largely led to the handbook phenomenon, okay, which we're going to see later in the Rhetorica ad Alexandrum. The other was more sort of the practice school, right? Rather than study, you need to practice. Imitation, memorization of great models. So you'd read a great speech, and then you go memorize it, and then you go recite it in front of your teacher, or you'd show up someplace where someone was giving a great speech, whether it's Demosthenes or whatever, and you would sit there and you would listen carefully, and then you'd have to go back to school the next day and try to recite it from memory, or try to imitate a Demosthenes-like speech. So one was kind of the technical handbooky way of studying. The other one was the practice way of studying. Kind of think of it in this way, like you learn a foreign language. Back in my day, they taught you foreign languages because you had a grammar handbook, a Spanish grammar handbook or a German grammar handbook, and you learn the parts of speech and how to, verb declensions and that kind of stuff, versus the kind of Rosetta Stone approach, right? Just do it, fall right into it, it'll come naturally to you, learn the second language as though it's your first, and that kind of thing. Now the important thing is to remember is this: instruction in rhetoric was considered post-secondary instruction. You would go to school until you were about 14 years of age, and you would learn those four major subjects, essentially a kind of an ancient quadrivium, if you would. And those were the basics. Those were your basic subjects. One of them we would consider PE, athletics. But those were the basic things. When you were 14, then you would go and start learning rhetoric from one of these teachers, right? That's important because, modern folks that look at these kinds of things like cognitive development really do make the case that until you reach adolescence, you're really not able to argue. In fact, most people think late adolescence, very late adolescence. There are many people who say that we shouldn't teach argumentation until people are about 20. But you certainly aren't capable of arguing effectively pre-teen. So why waste your time trying to do that? I mean, you can make them memorize stuff, and that's fine, but largely teach them poetry, and they'll learn skill in argumentation a little bit later on. Now, this group of people, we're going to look closely at a couple of them here in a few minutes. This group of people, called the Sophists, they were more diverse than people think they are, okay? We tend to think of the Sophists. Sophists ran the gamut from From Gorgias to Isocrates, even Plato really was a part of the sophistic movement. Okay, now he wasn't what we think of as a sophist because he wrote a lot of things against the sophists, but he was out of that tradition. That's for sure. The criticisms were this notion that they were moral relativists, that they were more interested in persuading people than they were in trying to arrive at truth. Right? It was better to persuade people, and in fact, some of these guys would even engage in rather silly exercises like persuading you that up is down and down is up, just see if they could do it. Right? So language. The criticism is you guys use language like it's a toy or something, right? And you really shouldn't do that. Plato's going to have a problem with that. The know-nothingism. There's this sort of skepticism on these guys' part that you can't really know anything anyway. So, but even if you knew it, you couldn't do anything about truth. Even if you couldn't use truth, even if you knew it. So the skepticism draws a lot of criticism and heat again from guys like Plato. There's this notion that that language has this. This is interesting. Has this sort of magical mesmerizing effect on the audience. You see this a lot in Gorgias. We'll look at him in just a second. The notion that language has this kind of power, this sort of psychic magical power over an audience to weave a spell and to captivate them. Quite a fascinating thing that goes way back to the notion of language as having sort of supernatural power, incantations, spells, ritual, religious kinds of things. And then the emphasis on imitation, or the notion that good speaking rubs off on you. If you're around good speakers long enough, you pick up on their ways of doing things. And this emphasis on natural ability, which you'll see in a moment, is really in contrast to some people who say, well, now wait a minute, if it's all about natural ability and it's just kind of something you just pick up by hanging around people who are really good at it, you're underplaying the need to study. And so Isocrates will address that a little bit more thoroughly when we get there.